Hello chess devotees. In one of my previous videos I did mention that one of these days I present to you a sort of a short rundown on Richard Réti's hypermodern work, New Ideas in Chess, and I'm about to do that in a few moments. Before I get onto it, I just thought I'd give a little bit of a background rundown on the hypermodern movement. Most players will be familiar with it, but I just thought I'd give you my feelings on it. As far as who originated this is concerned, well, there are a few candidates, but I think Aaron Nimzowitsch would be of the opinion that he did, because as far back as 1903 he was experimenting with his blockade and overprotection that he subsequently systemized in his My System, published in 1925. On the other hand, there is Julius Breyer, who in 1912 to 1914 was also experimenting. I think what you could say, though, is that as a result of a tournament that was held in Mannheim in Germany in 1914, it sort of created the kick-start to the process. This was a tournament that wasn't completed. It couldn't be completed because World War I had broken out. Alekhine was leading at the time, and he was awarded the first prize, and the prize money was split accordingly. The players were, that's to say, the non-German players, and anyone who was not from a country that was supportive of Germany in the war would be interned, and that was the situation that was the case throughout the First World War. They were interned in a place called Triberg, and from morning until night they had nothing else to do other than play chess, and they finally honed their skills such that quite a few of the players who were not quite of grandmaster level, at the end of hostilities they certainly were, so they were a force with which to be reckoned. And they devised what became known as the Indian defence, although nobody knew why it had been called that, but it was based on the control of the centre with pieces from the flanks rather than pawns in the centre. And so it was not only a system of defence, but also one for the first player that was developed by Richard Réti himself a few years later. As far as openings and defences named after the Hypermodern Brigade are concerned, well, if you look at the players that make up the Hypermodern movement, you have Breyer, Nimzowitsch, Alekhine, Réti, Bogolyubov, Tartakova, and Grunfeld. And you have the Breyer variation of the Ruy Lopez. There's the Nimzo Indian defence after Nimzowitsch, Bogo Indian after Bogolyubov, Grunfeld defence. Although not named after Tartakova, he did come up with a name for 1b4, followed by bishop b2, called the orangutan opening. He coined that after visiting the zoo in New York during the 1924 tournament. There's Alekhine's defence, e4, knight f6, and that was debuted by Alekhine at the Budapest tournament of 1921. And then, of course, the Réti opening came into being, which is knight f3, d5, c4, or in the case of this particular game, he started knight f3, d5, g3. But I believe it's the first time that it was employed, Réti against Rubinstein at Carlsbad 1923, and it was a win for Réti in 50 moves. It's not my intention to read out that much from this book. It's more like Réti himself puts it in the first paragraph of the foreword here. It's just not a tutorial in any way at all. It's just a series of articles that can stand alone or work in conjunction with each other. So let me read out the first paragraph here to you, and he'll make it clear as to what is going on. This book does not intend to be a textbook. I have tried to avoid anything purely didactic, nor is it systematic, but contains individual articles, each of which could stand on its own, but taken as a whole they will, I hope, suffice to introduce the reader to the mind of the youngest generation of chess masters. And here he does touch on Mannheim 1914 with a few of the hypermodern, or to-be hypermodern players. And this is the contents. he splits it into two essentially. Most of it is devoted to part two, the new ideas. Part one, the older grandmasters, as can be seen with players like Morphy, Steinitz, Lasker, Blackburn, and then the newer players like Capablanca, Alekhine, Vogel, Yubov, etc. I bought this book in the late 1970s. I spent very little money on it, and the seller said to me, if you decide that it's not for you, you can have your money back. Well, as you can see, I didn't ask him for the money back. I'm quite happy to keep it, and I'm still happy to keep it. So here it is, and I hope you enjoy having a look through this with me. This is known as the Die Unsterbliche Party, the Immortal Game. It was Anderson Kieseritzky at London 1851. But I believe an offhand game as opposed to actually having been played in the tournament. And it's a win for white in 23 moves. Although Kieseritzky, as you can see with the question marks, he did help in matters. But we won't take the gloss off Anderson in this one. This is mainly just to give the rundown, like he identifies, of the older masters. This is where he touches on Morphy. It's in Evans' Gambit. What he says interestingly about Morphy here in the final stage of this paragraph is that Morphy was the first to play by the rule, which later became common to all chess players, of developing his pieces with every move. And that is perfectly true, because Morphy was fond of stating, help your pieces to help you. And quick development, which is of course what he had in his style of play, invariably playing one e4, he'd get the pieces out quickly and in no time at all. Because he had such a good feel for the game, it quickly attained for him a winning position. So just have a look a bit further on. We're still on with Paul Morphy. As it's saying here, the open game, so that's confirming that Morphy was a man of the open game. He certainly wasn't a hypermodern, he wasn't a modern. Whether he could have adapted to that, who knows, but this is interesting here, which is on page 21, just looking at what it states. It looks as though there's a reference to Tal there, doesn't it? Of course, what it's actually saying is without T, A1. Now, T stands for term, which is the German word for rook. So what it's as good as saying is Morphy's playing an odds game here, and his rook on A1 has been removed. So we continue with more Morphy games. It gives a good rundown on all these older players with selected games. Another Morphy game there where he wins in 16 moves. We run into Wilhelm Steinitz, of course, with his modern chess instructor throughout the 1880s and 90s. A fine player, there's no doubt about that, and Lasker learnt a lot off him, I'm quite sure of it. And with that he subsequently dethroned him, of course, as everyone who knows anything about chess will agree. There's a match that was played between Tarish and Lasker in 1908 in Dusseldorf, and Lasker won that one pretty convincingly, and Réti's giving an example of one of the match games here. Quite a few exclamation marks floating around with Lasker's play, which you would expect, and he subsequently wins the game. And it touches on Lasker in 1917 here. He's wanting to bring those players who were still alive from the older period into the hypermodern period and show that they were able to, if not exactly embrace the hypermodern ideas, they were present and they were wondering how they were going to cope with it, as Dr. Emanuel Lasker admitted when he started in the New York tournament of 1924. He didn't know exactly how he'd do. Well, he won the tournament with a staggering 16 points out of a possible 20, so he was certainly very good. Rudolf Karuzek, who died at no age in 1900, as a matter of fact. So Réti's attempting clearly here to bring him up to date. Of course, he'd been dead for many years at that point. Just keep moving on. Blackburn Karuzek now. Blackburn was known as the Black Death. He was no spittoon in chess. He lost badly to Steinitz, I think, in the 1870s, but in this particular game, and although Karuzek made a move here with a couple of exclamation marks, it was Blackburn who won the day, as can be seen here. He wins in 36 moves. What is interesting to notice, and this is not the only occasion that this happens, that possibly the first person to own this book all those years ago has noted that some typos exist within, and he or she has altered it, probably a he, but in pencil. So, they're doing what they can, but they're just wanting to clarify the situation for anyone who wants to play over these games. And Schlechter Rubinstein. Still all the old masters. We haven't reached the start of the hypermodern period just as yet. Rubinstein, one of the greatest rook and pawn endgame players of all time. He is on my list of the greatest players. That subjective list, but anyway. And here, the Grandmaster tournament. They're using the term Grandmaster, which was given birth in 1914 at St. Petersburg, of course, by Tsar Nicholas II. And this was a quadrangular tournament between Lasker, Rubinstein, Schlechter and Tarrasch. In the year of Schlechter's death, he died on Christmas Day 1918 of starvation. What a dreadful end. Some of the greatest players have died in most unfortunate circumstances. Not the way that they should have left this earth at all. And Schlechter's style it's touching on here, and Schlechter's death. And now, of course, we reach the most or more important of the two parts, I suppose you could say. Although it's understandable why Réti's presented it the way that he has. He wants to build up to it and the new ideas. And he begins, and quite rightly, with Capablanca, who probably, if things had been different with the First World War, may well have annexed the championship much sooner than 1921. Although you could argue that if Rubinstein had played Lasker in 1909 or 10, it might have been the same result. But here we have a consultation game where on the black side Réti is consulting with Capablanca. So that is another good game. Like he points out, he's presenting articles, so he's doing a bit of a Morphy in some ways. Morphy never wrote any book on chess, although he did a column for the New York Times, I believe. He never actually wrote any book on chess, so he never expounded his theories in print. He let his games do the talking, and I think this is what Réti is wanting to get to here. More Capablanca games. And here we have a Réti game. Capablanca Amateur. This is all in the classical style, of course, because the Hypermodern hadn't started at this stage. We're still at the beginning of 1914. Although Capablanca was in at the right time, he's never to be regarded as a Hypermodern. Although, interestingly, at the New York tournament of 1924, when he played black against Edward Lasker, the opening was e4, g6, which is the modern defense, or Robach defense. And Alekhine, in his notes to that New York 1924 book, said that Capablanca once took the opportunity to play this joke of an opening, which is rather interesting given that Capablanca wasn't a hypermodern, but he was playing a hypermodern defense, and Alekhine was a hypermodern, and he was criticizing it. And what he said about this defense, and I'll quote him to you here, is that one should never commit oneself to a certain position until one's opponent has revealed his intentions. So I notice that online at the moment, Stockfish has put across a game that began 1A3 and couldn't understand the idea behind it? Well, I can tell Stockfish the idea behind it. It's Anderson's opening from 1858 against Morphy. And I'll stand corrected on this, but I think Anderson drew one and won one. And it's not a joke opening, A3. A3 often comes into play quite nicely, and Tony Miles proved it against Anatoly Karpov, I think in 1980-ish, and won with the black pieces. So the opening was E4, A6, and Miles won the game. So, and a very interesting game it is. It's a while since I played it over, but having thought about that one, I'll reintroduce myself to it sometime. So this is really the beginning here on page 71, the hypermodern style. So let me just quote what he's saying here. He's saying, this is what the outstanding chess master and chess writer Dr. Tartikova called the style of the youngest masters, the ones such as Alekhine, Bogolyubov and Breyer. So what he's as good as suggesting here, Richard Réti, is that Tartikova was the first to employ the name hypermodern. So although I'd regard either Nimzovich or Breyer, or both, as the father or fathers of the hypermodern movement, you probably have to look on Savili Tartikova as the one who originated the name for it. And there we have it in print, just to go back to it for a moment, the hypermodern style. According to Tartikova, yep, Dr. Tartikova called the style of the youngest masters as hypermoderns. So, very interesting. On page 73, yeah, we have, what is interesting here, I mentioned this at the beginning of this video, that it's to do with Breyer. It's not an opening that's often played, and it might be worth having a look at it sometime. I think I might do that myself. It's in the King's Gambit, accepted, and on the third move, White plays Queen to F3. So that might be something to consider if you want to surprise your opponent. Ein moderner Eröffnung. A modern opening is the Breyer Gambit. So that is possibly worth considering. For anyone who wants something a bit unusual, I believe that Magnus Carlsen is always looking to take the opponent out the book. I knew an elderly gentleman many years ago back in New Zealand who was a lighthouse keeper for many years, and then when he went into his retirement, he concentrated on correspondence chess for the last dozen years of his life and won a lot of trophies in the process. And he explained to me when I visited him in the 1970s that he liked to take the opponent out the book. So he's clearly a forerunner of the Magnus Carlsen way of looking at it. This is all very interesting stuff, and I can only reiterate, I would recommend it. He's touching on Alekhine here. Like he's saying, in this year, 1914, a new name, Alekhine, comes on the scene. So, and that is a French defense there, Alekhine. I believe he plays here what's called the Alekhine Chatard attack with h4 on the sixth move. Alekhine Bogolyubov, Treberg, but in 1921. And of course, Alekhine wraps it up in 18 moves. Now he's touching on Breyer again. I'm coming to a very interesting part here. Just before I do so, though, Réti's pointing out that during the wrapping up of the writing of this, it came to his attention that Julius Breyer had died in his 28th year in Bratislava. So that must have been a shock to him. Little did he know that within the space of about another 7.5 years, he'd be dead himself. Oh dear. Well, this is the interesting point here. This is something for which Julius Breyer was famous, where he said, "Nach sie ein I2 bis I4, die Weißpartie in den letzten Siegen lagen," which effectively translates to mean after 1 Porter King 4 or E4, White's game is in its last throes. So what he was as good as saying is it was struggling to survive. He didn't feel that E4 would last that much longer. He thought that the hypermodern system would supersede it in totality. Well, that is not the case, but he was certainly entitled to his opinion. But it shows you how deep set his hypermodern thoughts were. And what Réti has put here is credo quia absurdum. Now this is tied in with what Breyer has just uttered, and it effectively means, and it's linked, I believe, to Tertullian's dictum or paradox, although there was a question mark over whether Tertullian actually did say it or not, but it's ascribed to him, but I suppose the origins are lost in the midst of time. But the way that you need to look at credo quia absurdum, the Latin expression is, I believe because it is absurd. That is, the very impossibility of a proposition becomes, and it's mostly in theology, but it's not restricted to that, a kind of motivation for belief in it. Only certain propositions have such magnetism. So what Réti is as good as confirming here is that, in his opinion, Breyer had the magnetism to pull people into believing that what he said may well be so. And it's up to each person to decide for themselves whether that's right. I think that E4 will always have a place. And D4, any opening, like I explained just a few minutes ago, A3, Anderson's opening, A6, it doesn't really make any difference. The spike opening, G4, you can get away with virtually anything. And I would try anything because you might have some surprise value there. Even to this date, perhaps such openings are not exactly in-depth analysis in such as the search engines and other places. So you might just be able to catch the opponent out. So there's a Breyer game from Budapest 1917. He clearly had an aversion to E4. As can be seen here, he's playing D4. What is interesting to note is this is Budapest 1918. He died in 1921. And here he's employing B4 and Bishop B2. So he's already looking along the lines of the hypermodern system as it became fully blown in the 1920s. And he wins that game. Réti gives an example here of Breyer against himself at Budapest the following year, 1919. And on this occasion, although Breyer played some good moves, it's Réti who turns out to be the victor in that one. So he's touched on Capablanca, Alekhine, Breyer, and now Bogolyubov. Bogolyubov, Réti, Berlin, 1919. And quite a few exclamation marks from Bogolyubov here, and he wins that one. Pretty impressive, and Bogolyubov against no name. Bogolyubov was quite an underrated player in many ways. I know many have sort of written him off because he lost badly to Alekhine in 1929 and 1934, but I've played over a few of Bogolyubov's games and they are quite interesting and I'd recommend them. Tardikova, of course, the gentleman who coined the hypermodern name, apparently, according to Réti. And who am I to disagree with him? Another Tartikover Spielmann game at Vienna 1921. It is, as Réti indicates at the beginning, it's peppered with games to show that the style is becoming apparent. And Max Erber against Marozzi in Amsterdam 1921, a young Max Erber there, about 20 years old. And he wins in 18 minutes, a pretty impressive game. Capablanca Lasker from the World Championship match of 1921. And he gives a game here from that match. It's the 10th game, in fact. And what is interesting to note is, you see the first 16 moves here. And Lasker plays on his 17th. Lasker with 17, bishop takes d5 and the rest. It didn't quite work out, but in fact, Julius Breyer gives an analysis here that if he had in fact played bishop takes f6 and gives it 2 exclamation marks, it would have won for Lasker. Now, Lasker didn't win a single game in that World Championship match. He was beaten, I think, 4-0 with 10 draws. And at that stage, he felt that he just couldn't carry on, and he resigned the match, giving the title of third world chess champion to Capablanca. And he analyses it right the way down there, and it proves to be and mate in 2 moves. So that is very interesting indeed. So as good as Lasker was, particularly good as a psychologist in playing his chess, that's not wishing to take anything away from him. Again, he is one of those who is on my list of the greatest players of all time. And rightly so. I mean, he was world champion for 27 years, although he had a narrow scrape against Karl Schlechter in 1910. And in my opinion, Schlechter should have played for the draw in that final game and said, well, hang on a moment. We know Lasker's terms, but they were a bit unreasonable, weren't they? That you had to win by 2 clear points. I'm going to lodge an official complaint that I have beaten the world champion, and yet he's still world champion. There's something wrong here. It would have been an opportunity, perhaps, for Schlechter to have revamped the whole system, as he probably realised when it was too late. The final word here by Réti in this rather interesting book from a very long time ago. And those other publications by that publisher who had offices in Vienna, Berlin, Leipzig and Munich. So that is a very interesting book, and I hope you've enjoyed having a look at that. I think that wraps up my chess selection for the time being. I can't think of anything offhand that I have to present for the moment, but should I think of anything in the future, then stay tuned and I'll present it to you. In the meantime, as always, keep enjoying your chess, classical, hypermodern or otherwise, and remember, take the opponent out the book as quickly as you can. All the very best, and goodbye for now.